So today I wanted to discuss a different way to try to understand some of the differences within neurodivergent and neurotypical people, and trying to propose a little bit different way to understand it based on an analogy with language, and which I think could help describe some of the so-called symptoms of autistic people when interacting with neurotypical folks, and also understand kind of better what is going on. So I'm going to use an analogy with the way people learn language in childhood compared to adulthood. Um, this is not going to be super accurate, so the people who are into linguistics out there may be feeling a little bit of heartache at hearing some of the things I say. I am feeling it as well because I am somebody who was very keen into linguistics when I was younger, so I'll have myself a little bit of annoyance at what I'm saying, but I'm trying to keep it simple, so even people who are not into linguistics can kind of understand and follow the thing. So here's the thing: uh, how do we learn a language? Now the thing is, there are all sort of different possible sounds that human use in their different languages that exist all around the world. If you ever had any experience trying to learn a foreign language, you know that there are some particular sounds which are common in the other language, which may not be common in English, and vice versa. So if you try to learn a different language from your own, you will have some difficulties learning some of the sounds they use, and they will have difficulties with some of the sounds they use in English. And this is kind of obvious, but how does it work exactly? So the thing is, as a child, you have basically a sensitivity to any possible sound system. So any of the possible variations within a language. So let's simplify and call it letters, as in the letters in the alphabet, even though letters and sounds are kind of different things, so the analogy is not perfectly accurate, but let's stick with that. So you have, say, in English, you have, in most languages, you will have some 26, 25, 20 letters, and the actual amount of sounds can be a little bit different. So actually English has like 45 sounds, Spanish has about 26, but since we're sticking with letters, let's just say it, okay, the 26 letters of the English alphabet, and that's about it. Now, there are a lot of different sounds. So, for instance, the International Phonetic Alphabet, which is kind of a collection of all the different vowels and consonants which exist in any potential language, and which is used by people in linguists to describe all the different sounds that you can find in all different languages. Because if you look at the letter, how it is written, not every language uses a Latin alphabet to begin with. Even those who use the sounds is not always the same. So for instance, the sounds normally written as V in German is W, and V sounds like F in German. So it's not perfectly accurate. Anyways, let's say there is this limited set of large sets of sounds, which is described in the International Phonetic Alphabet. It's 107. So there is 107 different possible sounds that are used in different human languages, only a few of which are used in any specific language, actually. Now, so there are all sorts of different systems as well. So for instance, one of the things that foreigners find very difficult in learning Chinese is the fact that they have this system of intonation. So based on the intonation you have on a single word, it actually changes the meaning. And we Italians have that as well, actually, just for the phrases. So for instance, we use intonation to change a sentence from affirmative to a question. So for instance, in English, you have, if you say, oh, this is Marco, it's if you make a question out of it, you change the order of the words. Is this Marco as opposed to this is Marco. So you invert the subject and the verb, and that's what changes it to a question. Now in Italian, we don't have that, and the affirmative version and the question are essentially the same. The only difference is the intonation. So we have questo è Marco, which is this is Marco, and we have questo è Marco, which the words are exactly the same, but the intonation goes a little bit higher at the end, and that's a question. So questo è Marco, period. Questo è Marco, question mark. Now, so what happens is that as a child, you have sensitivity to any of the possible variations that a human can produce. That's why you have, it has nothing to do with genes. It's something that's purely environmental, and we all know that, because if you take, say, a Chinese kid and we raise it in Italy, they will not have sensitivity to, as they grow up, they won't understand these tones that are present in Chinese, even if they are racially, ethnically Chinese. And if you take an Italian baby and bring it to China, they instead will have this sensitivity. But the thing is, rather than being a development, rather than learning something, what happens is that we actually shut something off. So as children, we are sensitive to any possible variation of the human sound. So we can pick any sort of difference. And as we beyond a certain age, basically the system gets restricted and shut down to something which is more simple. So for example, you will have that in Finnish, you don't have this opposition between linguistics calls it voiced and voiceless consonants. We don't really need to know what that is, but it's a thing by which the consonants like P and B are kind of similar the way they're constructed. You can see that in your mouth, in your tongue, the way you pronounce P and B are kind of the same. The only difference is the action of the vocal cords, and that's called voiceless and voiced, but we don't care about that. The only thing we need to know is that in Finnish, this difference is not noticeable anymore. People don't use this as a differentiator between different sounds. So, and you can see, for instance, this by my name. I'm David or David, and in Finnish that's Taavetti, because there is no real difference between T and D. Again, you can say T and D. The way you move the tongue against the teeth, T and D, is pretty much the same thing. The only difference is the action of the vocal cords. Finnish don't use that, so my name, they pronounce it as Taavetti, because T and D, they experience it as being kind of the same sound. There is an anecdote by a professor of behavioral biology, Professor Sapolsky, who has this funny anecdote about a Finnish colleague, and he was wondering about how to make practice incisions for surgery, and so he asked his colleague how to practice, and he said, well, practice on a bear. And Sapolsky was very confused by this statement. So how is it exactly safe and useful to go practice incisions on a bear? And you have that this Finnish professor was actually suggesting that, okay, practice on a bear or an apple, and he was very confused until he realized, oh, he meant a pear, not a bear. But this sentence, try on a pear or an apple, which makes sense, it suddenly becomes this, try on a bear or an apple, because Finnish people don't really distinguish between P and B in a lot of words. So again, similar to my name, David becomes Taavetti, the British word bank becomes punky, and so on. So the way it works is, as a kid, you can recognize all these differences. As an adult, all these different potential sounds, so if let's say we can compare all the 107 different sounds that you have in the International Phonetic Alphabet, many of them collapse onto a single thing. So for instance, the sound which is different between a P and a B the sense that which is different between a D and a T in certain languages, uh, basically both of these sounds which are different collapse onto a single thing, and therefore the person who has now kind of fixated their mind, the mind becomes more rigid in this sense. It has become adapted to only not assess this difference, but only assess this as a single thing. They have categorized it as a single thing. Um, doesn't hear the difference. So you have that P and B, now they become one single sound, and that's about it, one single letter, and that's about it. Now, why do we do this? Okay, it will seem like a very inefficient way of doing things. You know, if we have the capability to assess different things, why as we grow we lose this ability? And this is not just the language. So for instance, there is a study by Pascal who has investigated the way can, for instance, kids distinguish between individual monkeys, or are all monkeys I think this was macaque monkeys or something like that. Can kids learn to distinguish each individual monkey by their face, or do all the monkeys look the same? And it turns out that children at age of 6 can learn that. By age 9 they have lost this ability unless they have been exposed to photos of monkeys, in which case they retain this ability. So they are not learning, they are just there is a difference which exists, but it gets simplified, and all the variation in the faces of the individual monkeys gets lost basically as we grow. Same as it works with the sound. This is, by the way, one of the reasons why sometimes white people in the West will tell you something like, oh, all Asians look the same, or all black people look the same, which neurologically speaking is kind of true, because if you grow up only looking at faces of your own race, so you're white in the West, you're primarily going to see faces which are white Westerners' faces. So you will see, oh, all the white Westerner faces have faces which are different from one another, where you can recognize it very well. You won't be as sensitive to the variation of people, of Asian people or black people, and then therefore you look at them and they look all the same. Whereas for them it will be the opposite. Probably nowadays not, because anyways most people are exposed to famous white Western actors, so the variation is seen, is maintained, the sensibility to this variation is maintained, but in principle it will be the same thing. So it's not like white Western people have more individual variation and Asians and blacks actually look the same, but neuropsychologically speaking, the effect is there. It's we lose the sensitivity to see those sort of differences, and therefore they look all the same. Exactly the same thing as with language. So P and B are different, and if you are found yourself in a situation where the people around you speak a language where they differentiate between a pear and a bear, they are two different things. So you're like, oh, I cannot just assume that P and B are the same, because a pear is not the same thing as a bear, and therefore you maintain the ability to distinguish between the sound. But if you grow up in Finland, you don't, people around you don't make this difference, so they kind of become the same thing. So you have this complex system of multiple possible sounds which are there, which all collapse into one single thing, and you get stuck in that. Now, to answer why we do that will be kind of complicated, but I have argued elsewhere that basically the role of the brain is to simplify things, and this is primarily in my lectures about culture and lectures about the way we perceive things, and the ways reality, what we experience as reality, is actually a psychological construct, something that we create in our brain. So it's kind of a different topic, which I have covered also, so I won't go into details, but let's just keep it at the fact that basically it simplifies things. By simplifying things, it makes the judgment faster and more effective. So this is kind of the whole point. Okay, so why all these long conversation about how language work? Who cares? And I would argue that this is actually a lot of what is going on and what is the difference between the neurotypical mind and the autistic mind. So I would say that suggest that the neurotypical mind is fast and rigid in the way someone who only speaks one language has grown up in a culture when they only speak one language, only speaks one language, is attuned perfectly to the concept of that single language. The autistic mind is more keen on to detecting different ways, the differences which are actually there, and see more patterns, can be adapted to more patterns, and this makes the autistic mind slow but flexible. Now, how does this works in practice? We have this stereotype about autistic people being quite rigid and inflexible, and this is something I cover elsewhere because I think this is it is actually the opposite. Because if you go look at levels of creativity, for instance, autistic people is much more, generally speaking, more creative than the neurotypical person. And but on the reason of why that we have this misconception about autistic people being rigid, I'll discuss elsewhere. So right now, let me just say, very briefly, that that's kind of what it is. So sorry, the neurotypical person is stuck into a system, whereas the autistic person is not very well adapted to that specific system, and that's why it is divergent, because it's more attuned to seeing things that a neurotypical person doesn't see. So, for instance, say the neurotypical who does things which are more mainstream is more attuned to what is the common rule, to what is the predominant rule within a certain social setting, or even within any intellectual interest or any hobby. The neurotypical person will be the one who is attuned to what everyone else is doing and seeing. The autistic person will be the one who will say weird stuff. So maybe everybody is looking at the red flower, and the autistic person will be the one who is there. Oh, I actually like more the blue flower. The blue flower is kind of cool. So thinking in a divergent way, uh, being more attuned to possible differences and being more flexible over the variation of things. And this is what makes autistic people also slow and not perfectly adapted to what the social rule is, because instead of being stuck into a system, they are kind of uh, available to all possible system, or at least more possible system than the neurotypical person is, but henceforth they also are not perfectly attuned to any. So this will be like the neurotypical person will be like the person who has grown within a certain culture, within a certain language, only speaks that language, has is perfectly attuned to that language. The autistic person will be like the polyglot who speaks multiple different languages. He's thinking, he's adapted to all different possible variations, but struggles at least a little bit because of these all potential incongruencies, all these potential different systems which don't always are exactly the same. So it is kind of more complicated. So I can actually make an example using the same sentence I used before in Italian. This is Marco, which in Italian is questo è Marco. So now, I actually, okay, a little bit background here. I have, among my other things, I live in Finland, and I am half Italian. So one of the activities I have been doing has been to teach uh, Finnish people Italian language in Finnish. So this actually came to me a few days ago. I think it was last week, Tuesday, in the beginner class, or in the Italian beginner class. We had this. We were practicing this sort of statements such as "Questo è Marco." This is Marco, and one of the students said, "Questo è Mika," which is a common Finnish name, And however, I went into a little bit of confusion because for Italians language has gender. So if you are talking about a man, you say questo è Marco, for instance, which is Marco is a male name. If you have a female name, so say Marta, you have questa è Marta. So questo is the male version, questa is the female version. So questo è Marco, questa è Marta. So my students say questo è Mika, which was correct because Mika is a male name in Finland. You can remember Mika Hakkinen, for instance, as one of the actually famous Finnish people. The problem is that a ending words in Italian tend to be seen as feminine. So, in my head, Mika immediately came off as female as opposed to being male, and therefore I was about to correct the student, say, "Ah, no, you should have said questa è Mika," and then I realized in my head, wait a second, I'm being confused right now because Mika in Italian Mika it ends with an a, so it sounds like feminine, but I know that in Finland Mika is a male name, and therefore questo and Mika, which is the font student used, was actually the correct one. But it took a little bit of mental processing, and I'm perfectly fluent in Italian. It's the language I am most fluent in, and I live in Finland, so I know perfectly well that Mika here is a male name. But being in Finland in an Italian class, trying to teach Italian while speak in Finnish, has caused this little mental shortcut there, because I was like, oh, wait a second, there is this Italian based rule that Mika should be female because it ends with an A, and there is this Finnish based rule that Mika is a man's name. So it went into a little bit of confusion. So as the student said that, I was about, oh, wrong, I need to correct you here. And then I realized, oh, wait a second, no, I'm the one who's wrong. Even if I'm teaching you Italian, I'm being confused now about which version you should be using, questo or questa, because it's a little bit of extra processing. So this is a very simple example of something that can be happening in the autistic mind. So it's not perfectly attuned to a language. It's flexible to different sets of language, different sets of rules, but this also means that there is a little bit of this extra processing going on there, which makes things a little bit slow and sometimes a little bit ineffective, which is what autistic people are in a social setting. So it's like they depending on how high functioning, low functioning, even that's not a term that many autistic people like to use, but it's like, you can attune to what the social rule is, but it's kind of like a little bit more effortful instead of just coming natural and spontaneous the way neurotypical have it. And that's but on the other hand, there is also this kind of flexibility to adapt to a different thing. So for instance, moving to the discussion from language to something more social context relevant, something more relevant to social context, you have that eye contact. So in some cultures, holding eye contact is something that is very important to develop a more feeling of intimacy, trust, friendliness. So if you don't hold eye contact, you look away, you can look either shy or rude or something like that. In some cultures, holding eye contact means that you are being quite rude and quite aggressive, because you're being domineering, and therefore to not hold eye contact is considered more humble and friendly and socially acceptable. So what happens with the neurotypical person, again, is like speaking one single language and attuning perfectly to it. So you'll have to, for the neurotypical person, being attuned to this eye contact holding rule, whether it is hold eye contact or whether it is not hold eye contact, it becomes perfectly natural. It becomes second nature. Um, it becomes just as Finnish people hearing bear or pear and being kind of the same thing. It's just you don't see that. Okay, this is it, and period. We act like this. This is the norm here. This is the rule. This is how we talk. This is how we behave. No question there. It comes perfectly fluent and natural the way one person who has uh, grown up speaking one single language will become perfectly attuned to that single language. It's perfectly natural. The autistic person instead will always have this look divergently. They will look at this all possible variation. So an autistic person may feel like neither of these rule is perfectly, so holding eye contact or not holding eye contact is not, neither of that is perfectly attuned. It's not something you can settle in perfectly and ignore everything else, which is what the neurotypical person is doing basically. Oh, this is what you are looking at, ignore everything else. Like the Finnish person who hears bear and pear, ignore it because we don't use the difference between P and B, so they're the same. So it's just they don't see the difference. The autistic person is someone who, oh, I do see the difference, so I need to make some extra processing to detect whether it is a pear or a bear. For us, it's different sounds. Um, so now, the way this unfolds in a social setting is again, the autistic person can be actually more flexible and adapt. So, if they're used to this social context where holding eye contact is very important, they may have an easier time than the non-autistic person to adapt suddenly to a culture where holding eye contact is rude. For the autistic person, it doesn't really make any difference to begin with. They will be thinking like, okay, why does it even matter whether we hold eye contact or not? Let everybody do how they like, and that's perfectly fine. So we have, this adaptability to all possible variation. We don't really care, and that makes us more flexible, but it also creates this extra processing thing, such as me, if I'm in Italy and I only speak Italian, I always know that, for instance, mica would be a female sounding, so I say questa è mica, and I don't think about it, and I don't have to process anything, it just comes perfectly natural. But since I'm in Finland speaking to Finnish people trying to teach Italian, I need to have this little bit of extra processing of what is what. And so sometimes it comes that, okay, I'm just saying something like super basic, like super beginner level or usage of language and say, oh, questo è Marco, questo è Mica, but oh, wait, questo or questa, because I have this flexibility of, oh, if I'm in Finland, this is the rule. If I'm in Italy, this is the rule. So it's not perfectly set in. So how does this unfold in a social context? And this is what will be actually a subject for another video. Again, the neurotypical person is more attuned to stereotypes, common rules, do something that's ordinary. The autistic person will be divergent. They will do something unexpected. They will struggle in seeing the things that seem obvious to the neurotypical person, and we'll see this better in another video, but here is an example of how it may unfold. So say I am going to go on a date with a woman. As a neurotypical man, what I will do is I'm kind of stuck and rigid into a certain set of rules, stereotypes, which can be different based on the countries I am, but I'm attuned to my set of rules in my social context, in my country, in my culture, and it just becomes second nature. I don't question it, I just act upon it. I'm fast, I'm rigid, but fast and effective. So what happens when I go on a date with this woman is that maybe I'll bring her flowers because, oh, everybody knows that women like flowers, and therefore I don't really think about much anything. I just get the flowers, I get them to her. She's happy, she's smiling at me, she's liking me, and that's all perfectly nice and fun, and we go on from there. Now, the autistic person, what would we say about the autistic people? Oh, yeah, did you miss the memo? Something that, everybody seems to know and the autistic person doesn't. Autistic people often do say that, when people are dating, for instance, it's like feels everybody is giving this set of uh, this rule book with this set of rules which everybody knows of, and they kind of don't have it. And the thing is that what may happen is that the autistic person, as an autistic man now, I go to a date with this woman, and what I may think is something like, oh, yeah, there is this stereotype about women liking flowers, but I'm more attuned, as opposed to being attuned to the stereotype, to the prevalent norm, I think more divergently, more differently. So I might think, well, okay, I know there is this rule, but I'm not really sure about this rule, because I know that, yes, maybe more women than not do like flowers, but how in the world do I know if this individual woman likes flower? So maybe I'll have to, instead of bringing her flowers, I may ask first, does she like flower? And I feel like this is being nice and respectful, because instead of going into assumption about what she likes and being a stereotypical man and just following the rules, doing the same things as everyone else, I'm being listening, and I'm being trying to figure out what she likes, because I don't know if she likes flower, or maybe she is a woman who doesn't like flower, contrary to the stereotypes, and maybe like cars and machines, and maybe instead of flowers she'd rather have a toolbox. So and this creates all sort of misconception, because the autistic person may think, well, Joe, I'm just trying to understand, I'm just trying to listen, I'm just trying to be polite, instead of assuming what you like and bringing you flowers. I'm trying to figure out what you like, and the woman may be kind of pissed, because it's like, isn't this supposed to be obvious what I want, and aren't you supposed to already know? So at Harris comes all this, oh, did you miss the memo, or why does everyone has the rule book instead of me? Because you're attuned to these possible differences instead of being stuck into a mindset. So you're flexible, but that makes you kind of ineffective and sluggish in taking action, in the way the person who is more attuned to that social norm would already have done, while you are there thinking, oh, I'm trying to figure out what you like. And the same happens then, instead of when, say, the woman gives this guy the toolbox, because there is a stereotype the guy is supposed to like machines, the guy is supposed to like cars, so if I give him a toolbox he's going to like it. And the neurotypical man, who is more attuned to these social rules, may be like, oh, I got what I wanted, I got what I'm expected to like. And by the way, gender dysphoria and prevalence of non-binary individual is much higher in autism, and this is one of the reasons. We just don't go into this following what's the stereotype of the gender or other social rules. You just kind of think in a different way. So when the neurotypical man gets the toolbox and has given the woman the flowers, everybody is happy. But if this guy is autistic, then it may be like, well, what am I supposed to do with the toolbox? I don't act like everybody else. I'm not following the gender stereotypes. And so maybe now I find you actually a little bit rude and assumptive by not asking me what I like and assuming what I'm supposed to like. And then again, this will create this sort of miscommunication, where the neurotypical woman says, oh, I'm just being nice, and being, giving you, acting like everybody does, and you're supposed to be happy now, while you're being weird and complicated. And the autistic person may be like, yeah, because it's not, I don't think like that, so it feels weird to me to just force myself into liking something that I don't really care of, just because everybody else is doing it. And so this is kind of pretty much the same difference as in my case in my classroom, of me not really being immediately able to figure out if questo è mica or is it questa è mica, because we are more into this flexible but sluggish mindset, as opposed to this rigid but fast and effective mindset, which is the person who speaks one only language, as opposed to the person who is has the ability and the skill to talk many different languages, but it becomes kind of juggly because at sometimes you have circumstances in which the circuit goes a little bit, in a loop, or gets a little bit stuck because it's not perfectly adapted to a specific system either, right? So I do think this is a good way to describe part of the differences between the neurotypical mind and the autistic mind. So uh, a system which is perfectly adapted and therefore fast, but rigid and stuck into a system, into a way of thinking, as opposed to a system where there is more flexibility, there is more divergence, there is more sensitivity to different sort of things, and this allows for greater creativity, greater originality, divergence of thinking in a different way, thinking out of the box. But on the other hand, it's not perfectly attuned to any specific pattern of thinking, which therefore makes it more sluggish, slow, prone to misunderstanding, prone to having to clarify things, as not having things to read things between the lines as neurotypical does, which is kind of hard for autistic people to do because it's confusing, because we are not attuned to that specific system, but it's one option. But if it's only one option, as opposed to be, well, that's what it is, as it is for a neurotypical person, it's only one option what it could be. And therefore, if you don't specify exactly, oh, this is this, how do I know if it only written between the lines? How do I know among all the possible options that I am considering which one it is? So you'll have autistic people having, to tell things then more in a literal way, be more keen on being precise, not getting things between the lines, because it could be this. For the neurotypical person, it's just, oh, this is it. Just for as for the Finnish person, B and P, you don't think, oh, is it a B or is it a P? It is what it is. You don't have to think, you don't have to process it. But for the autistic person, it's more like, oh, I am sensitive to all this possible variation. So if you don't tell me, is you don't specify clearly if the sound is a B or it is a P, how in the world am I supposed to know if you're talking about a bear or you're talking about a pear? Because for me, these are two different options. They are very different. I spot these possible differences and these possible options, which maybe you don't. But therefore, it also takes me a little bit more work to figure out something that for the neurotypical person may just be banal, and it's like, oh, it's just this, why you don't get it? So I hope this is helpful, and I do think this is a very good way to understand the differences between the neurodivergent autistic mind and the neurotypical mind, and helps to bridge a little bit this gap in conversation, because you can understand now the gap in conversation is kind of the same thing. If and I'll make a separate video about this specifically, but say if I'm an Italian guy and I already speak Italian, I'm come to England and nobody speaks Italian there, then it's going to be a little bit confusing to, fix into this gap of understanding, and there is these differences in the way we express things and we process things, which is what creates this miscommunication and differences of assumptions between the autistic person and the neurotypical person. Thank you.